And welcome to TopRight's first 2021 webinar. This event is on place branding, creating value beyond names, logos, and slogans. If you haven't yet, please visit our website at toprightpartners.com, sign up for our weekly newsletter. Our moderator today is our CEO, Bill Fasig. He'll tell you a little bit more about the content in a moment, but he's going to be speaking with our four fantastic speakers today. Up first, we're going to have Brandon Palanker, CEO of 3BL Strategies and an subject matter expert in the field of place branding as it relates to the practice of real estate, economic development, and placemaking. Brandon is also a TopRight partner. Second, we're going to have John Pulomena. He has been head administrator at Middlesex County, New Jersey for over 10 years and has also a pretty formidable background at AT&T and Bell Labs where he worked communications. He's going to talk to us a bit about place branding from the perspective of government administration. Third, Clark Dean, managing director at Transwestern Real Estate, also a Harvard grad with years of experience in corporate consulting. He's going to come at us from the perspective of private industry and real estate development. And lastly, but not leastly, Christopher Zimmerman, Vice President of Economic Development at Smart Growth America, a community design nonprofit based out of Washington, D.C., and also a former elected official on the Arlington, Virginia County Board. So he's going to speak to us from probably a bit from the government perspective as well as the nonprofit perspective on place branding. To everyone, this event is being recorded. There will be a 10 or 15 minute Q&A at the end of the very end of the hour. So if you have questions, please at any time use the chat box to enter them in. Gary Toth, can you turn your camera off for us? Thank you, sir. Let me know if you have any questions in the chat box, and I will get to them at the very end of the hour, at which point we'll have sort of a group discussion, quick back and forth. And the whole thing should last about 60 or 70, maybe 75 minutes. And now I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Bill Fasig. Bill, you are on mute.
Oh, yes.
There you go.
You would think we would all have learned that by now. Let me do that again. Welcome to all of you to our forum on place branding. Thank you for joining us in the middle of the day. I think these sorts of Zoom meetings, team meetings are all becoming sort of normal part of our life, which frankly leads into the question that we are talking about today, which is part philosophical question, but part real question for business and organizations. And that is, what is place? What is the place we work? What is the place we live? What does it mean today? It's changed a bit over this past year. Oddly, it's been almost exactly a year since we've all been wearing masks and many of us working remotely. And what has that done to any organization or government entity's ability to talk about a place and to brand a place, if you will, and explore the demand for place branding? One of the things that we've learned in our work, and in full disclosure, you'll hear from John Pulomena, Middlesex County is a longtime client of ours, and our engagement with the other speakers as well, from different aspects, is that it's the definition of what place is today and what it needs to be, how you brand it, how you tell a story about it, is shifting. And obviously, it's obvious why destinations in the past, or it's still today, talk about place branding or engage with place branding. For tourist destinations, whether it's Orlando or Las Vegas or Caribbean Islands or Hawaii, whatever it is, that's a very specific type of place branding. But what does it mean now when the very definition of where you live, work, engage, play is changing, and where you're actually seeing migrations away from some of the mega cities and mega environments, including even big corporate relocations, not just around cost, but around giving people flexibility and in their lifestyle and how they work and their quality of life. And what does that mean in terms of how those places, if you will, tell the story? How do you attract those organizations, not simply from the standpoint of economic development, where if you think back to the Amazon bid, you're trying to compete based on who gives the biggest tax incentives, but telling the story around why come to a particular place and what does that place now mean? And can places have brands in the same way that a company has it? And I think what you're going to hear today is that, in fact, not only do they have brands, they have to have brands because they have to be able to engage in a conversation. And in the same way, businesses and developers are asking, how can I attract and retain skilled workers to my area? How can I improve community and local economy? Government administrators, how can I communicate what my municipality, my regional government, my state government has to offer in a clear and cost-effective way that talks about bringing in new residents, new businesses, improves quality of life, and by the way, of course, grows tax revenues. And across the country, getting these answers now is more critical than ever. Obviously, whatever the normalcy is that we come back to, God willing, soon, as we can come out of this pandemic, there are some things that have permanently changed. There are some things that will go back to the way, perhaps the way they were, but the very definition of where you must live and work and engage and where your family wants to be, I think, has shifted. It's starting to shift and it's continuing to shift, and we're at the start of that transformation. How and why people live or work where they do. And when circumstances now allow, or in some cases even require, for people to live anywhere, it becomes our responsibility to communicate with clear, aligned brand stories that engage people around why your, in quotation marks, and in reality, why your place matters. And that burden is on all of us, the planners, the administrators, the branders, the storytellers, to really rediscover the fundamentals of how story feeds directly into what place branding really means. And with that short intro, I'm going to turn it over to our expert in TopRight, Brandon Palanker, and ask you, Brandon, to kick it off by talking about what does place branding mean? What does it mean to you? Why is it important? And how is the marketing of that place related to the growth of a region, the growth of a company, and even people's options as they look for where they live, work, and play and engage? Brandon?
Appreciate it. Thank you. Assume I can be heard clearly. You never quite know. Tyson, I'm sure will let me know if that's not the case. First, I just want to thank everyone for participating, certainly those in our audience. I really love this opportunity to sort of talk about two passions of mine, marketing and communications and placemaking, sort of that confluence. And I know we're in somewhat of a crazy period with COVID, and there are a lot of shifts in terms of the placemaking aspects to some degree. But today we're really going to be talking about some of the more foundational aspects. And I think in a COVID and post-COVID world, branding and perhaps rebranding of places is as or more important than ever. So to understand what place branding is, let's start at its root, place and placemaking. And for those from wearing my real estate development and placemaker's hat, placemaking often connotes sort of tinkering around the edges, talking about how to activate a public park, create a food truck court, expand sidewalks. I personally, having been a master developer of mixed-use downtowns for 15 years, I take a much broader view of placemaking. I believe placemaking is everything involved in the creation of a great place: visioning and planning, infrastructure design, zoning, development, and ongoing place management. And this is so important because those placemaking efforts generally in today's world create more vibrant, walkable locations. And they become an important tool to improve community, foster revitalization, and as we'll soon discuss, drive economic development. And this has really contributed to the evolution of the marketing of places known as place branding. But to understand this evolution, let's take sort of a quick primer, in the evolution of place itself. The last 20 years has seen a significant shift. We've seen a shift from auto-oriented, single-use, sprawling suburbs to a focus on more walkable urban neighborhoods. And that can be a core district like Manhattan, and I know there are certainly reactions there with COVID, but just as well for a suburban downtown or a rural Main Street. And I think we have to understand that this shift back to sort of walkable urban places is nothing new. It's really a return to our roots. I mean, we've lived in villages for about 10,000 years. For about 9,900 of those years, our lives were dictated by how far we could walk, what was within 15 to 20 minutes, everything we needed from social interaction to goods and services. And even through the rise of cities, from Rome through the Middle Ages, through the 1800s, neighborhoods and districts maintained this 15-minute walk shed before sort of going and giving way to that next district. Well, this all was turned on its head with the advent of the automobile in post-World War II and the expanse of auto-oriented suburban environments. And the suburbs provided this respite from the overcrowded city, bucolic living, freedom, mobility, economic success. But with it, eventually with growth and overgrowth, had some downturns. Traffic, pollution, isolation took hold. And the real tipping point was with the millennial generation, where as a reaction to we Xers and their parents, the baby boomers, wanted an alternative to what they saw as sort of these boring, soulless suburbs. And that certainly doesn't mean all are, and many have advanced of late, but it was a reaction. And we saw these cities take center stage again in the 1990s, as exemplified on TV. Friends and Seinfeld, ER, Grey's Anatomy represented the aspiration of this younger market for more urban environments and this new emphasis on the quality of place. No longer was the mall as the center of social and economic activity. That wasn't enough. And with that, the in-demand young workforce became mobile. They decided what lifestyle they wanted to live, chose a location, and then moved there, and then looked for a job, as opposed to a factory town, whether it's 100 years ago with a mill town or 50 years ago with an IBM suburban campus. No longer were employees following the employers, but rather the employers were going to areas that provided them the workforce that they needed. This was really a turning point in place making and place branding, as we'll get to shortly. So what does all this have to do with place branding? It has to do with everything, because place itself, the experience you have in a place, in a district, a neighborhood, that's become an experience to sell, much like a product or a service. Foster economic growth, economic development. And place branding has always been around, but it used to revolve around destinations and tourist attractions, logos, slogans, catchy phrases, iconic or less than iconic imagery that was utilized to tell the story in the mind of a consumer why they should visit, travel, and spend their money. Well, over time, this effort to attract temporary visitors expanded to reach new audiences. And nothing's been more impactful in this evolution than the role of economic development agencies and the need to attract jobs and new tax revenues. And recognizing that these businesses wanted to locate to where the workforce itself was, changed everything on its head. The place itself became the major driver in attracting new residents and businesses to expand the tax base. That doesn't mean that tree-lined streets and great schools and the things that attracted the C-suite were no longer important. They were and they are. But if you can't get that in-demand workforce, you are not going to be able to attract those corporate headquarter locations. You're not going to attract that innovation type of economy. So this starts to come down to how do you create this story and drive that type of growth? And as we marketers call it, it's branding, which in my opinion is the foundational piece to all marketing, whether it's marketing a district, a consumer product, or a service. After all, a brand is the promise that a product or service conveys to the consumer based on their core value proposition. Why are you going to buy from me? Or in terms of a place, why are you going to visit, relocate, or open up shop? And it's just as essential to remember that a brand narrative needs to be rooted in the question of why does a product or service or a place exist? What is its core purpose? What problem or problems does it solve for the customer? How does it make their lives better, make them happier, help their businesses become more successful? And in terms of place, the why of a neighborhood, a district, has to explain what is the rationale? How are you going to serve the needs of the various audiences, from residents to businesses, both those that exist today and those into the future? And to accomplish that goal, it's essential to create a clear and compelling brand narrative that is impactful and consistent. And part of that consistency is that your brand has to be an accurate, if inspirational, representation of your actual product. If you promise one experience, but you deliver another, even if it happens to be a good experience, you're going to sow confusion in the market and your results will reflect that poor branding. Just as true when marketing a place, it's essential that that experience, that place brand, is authentic to the experience you will have when in that location. And if you can't tell a story that is backed up by the experience you provide. That goes back to the placemaking where we started this. If you want to be branded as a vibrant place to do business where, young people want to live, work, and play, where empty nesters can get out and sort of the folks who are still having in that family realm have their needs met. But if in reality you don't provide that range of experience, you might have to relook at yourself in terms of your development and your planning efforts, your placemaking efforts, so you become the story that you want to tell. And that's where the marketing and operation feedback loops happen. The market tells you what it wants, which you can learn through research, study, analytics. And if your product, be it a place or a service, doesn't meet the needs of that market or a specific market segment, you can either change your brand narrative to better connect, or you have to change your product or service. And in a case of place, this change really revolves around that idea of placemaking and providing consistency with the experience and the promise. So to close out, it's really about gaining a competitive advantage. You want a great product that meets the needs of the market. That's the placemaking to make your environment something that is attractive. You then need to tell that story of how your product improves the lives of those who will use it. That is the brand, in this case, place branding. And by creating this brand narrative, you connect with those customers, deliver to them your value proposition, and drive them to action. And action is for existing residents to be more informed and engaged, for real estate developers to invest, for businesses to move there. And as places and placemaking evolves, so too must place branding. So from an overarching perspective, I hope that sets the stage for this conversation, and happy obviously at the end to answer any questions, but really look forward to the folks who will come after me. Appreciate it.
Brandon, I'm going to turn it over to John in a second here. Before I do that, given what you just said, and given the competition today that exists between places, right, soliciting new resident businesses, what have you seen are the essential must-have elements of that story that allows a region or a location to really connect deeply, both from a business perspective as well as a residential perspective? Sure.
So it goes back to that question of why. What's the reason that place exists? What problem does it solve? So you're putting yourself in the shoes of your customer, of the customer segments. So from a resident, you have a range of residents. So let's segment that market as marketers do. You have young professionals that have a different set of needs than folks in their family time of life, and empty nesters whose needs, by the way, may mirror those of younger professionals. From a business perspective, it's about ROI. Business needs to make money, but the business recognizes that it's not going to get its ROI unless it's able to hire the top talent. There's a reason why businesses move to Manhattan. And again, COVID aside, and Manhattan will return, by the way, that's a topic for another day. They're willing to spend 50, 100, 200% on real estate, on cost of doing business, because they get that return. And that all comes down to the place itself and what that place represents. So if you're a municipality, you have to think, what is it that I want to be? What are my natural intrinsic assets that I have? And how do those assets meet the needs of these different market segments? How do you then create a story that is compelling to attract folks to an action? And where you might not have that story, how can you take real estate development or urban design efforts so that you can become the story that you want? I hope that sort of explained it to some degree, Bill.
It does. Yeah, it's a good segue because I'll turn it over to John Pulomena. And John, we've been working together for some years now, and you've been living this and telling the story of the place of Middlesex County, which is one of the absolutely vital counties in the entire Northeast, and that journey has been helping refine and create, refine, and focus that story, and now just recently launching a very large economic development campaign. So, from your perspective of managing and governing, if you will, the operations of a county as large and as diverse as Middlesex, speak to what place branding means from your perspective and how you have seen it evolve and take hold over these last years that we've been on this journey.
Well, first of all, thank you, Bill and TopRight, for giving me the opportunity to be part of this dialogue. And as you mentioned earlier, I come out of the private sector, 22 years in the Bell system and also in business for myself. And Also in the political arena, 10 years as a commissioner, and ultimately now the administrator of Middlesex County. And unlike the private sector, you know, when you look at most governmental entities at the local or county level, it's got some background noise. I don't know if that's me or.
Oh, everyone, please put the microphone on.
I just want to make sure it wasn't me. Thanks, Bill. You know, when you look at the private sector and the role branding and marketing plays in the products and services they offer, it's critical to their value proposition and their livelihood. On the governmental side, it was a little different. You know, not many local or county and even some state entities really don't spend a lot of time on the branding of who they are, what they are, why they do it. And they get stuck in a legacy role. You know, they create programs that they think are helpful or assisting the community. We're not necessarily doing a lot of the background analysis. And then those legacy systems live on forever. And really the value starts to diminish. And in this case, when we look at Middlesex County, we recognize that, you know, the journey we've been on where we had, you know, a bifurcated environment of 35 departments all running their own operations, own set of products and services, own set of pseudo marketing and branding, that became very confusing to the public. And so, you know, when you ask most people who live in a community, what's the role of government? You know, there's a lot of lack of clarity in that discussion, other than, I don't know, I'm spending tax, I know what my money's being spent on. And so I believe from a governmental standpoint, we have an obligation to start to frame the story around, you know, who we are, what we do, why we do it on behalf of the residents, both business and the residential community. And thus the journey we've been on with the branding of Middlesex County. You know, we had to really start to take a look at how do we incorporate the branding element to everything that we do the proper upfront analysis to make sure that the journey that we're going to be moving towards really encompasses the needs of our entire community in such a way that there's a value that it brings to them. And it just doesn't come with, you know, the branding, but it also comes with the relationships that you build from a public, private, and educational institution standpoint. You can't work in a vacuum. And that's one of the things that we've learned and have incorporated in our branding strategy. You know, leading together, our latest messaging, right, is a key component of that. And ultimately, when you look at the elements we have put in place relative to our brand strategy, it is about not just attracting the right businesses, but also ensuring that it's a sustainable economic growth for both the business and the people who live, work, and play here, right? And to do that effectively, you have to really ensure that you're understanding all elements of that community, right? And so, you know, from a governmental standpoint, I really believe that the value that we've learned through incorporating the marketing / branding strategy in everything that we do, it starts to bring focus and priority, not only to the outside world, but also to our workforce and the important role they play in that partnership. You know, because I always have said this in all my years, our greatest asset are the people who work in the governmental sector, right? But we have to make sure that we bring that right talent in. And along with the branding, you've got to make sure you're bringing all the other elements that are critical to that marketing success. You know, with COVID, a lot of entities have not been able to do an effective job in providing the services because they did not have the technology platform or the wherewithal to use that technology in a virtual environment to serve its community. So we were able to do that, partnering with TopRight, partnering with our marketing strategy, and partnering with the private sector to make sure that we did not miss a beat, okay? And in order to do that effectively, if we did not have that branding strategy in place, I think there would have been a lot of confusion on how we were going to continue to support our community in the essential service we provide. It's not just, you know, obviously economic growth we're concerned with it, but there are many social service programs that are absolutely essential to sectors of our community. And we have to make sure that as we continue to grow, that we leave no one behind. So when we look at our branding and our marketing strategy, it's encompassing a very diverse set of our population. And if you look at Middlesex County, it's probably one of the most diverse entities in the country today. And so it makes even our marketing strategy a little bit more challenging. but it's built on the foundation of that. We want people to not only work here, but to live here and to understand the value that both governmental as well as private sector entities bring to their quality of life, right? Because in a lot of instances, why do people stay in Middlesex County? Either they were born here and they just don't move, either they come here because they followed their job, or maybe a family member moved. But in many instances, people kind of, they stay where they're at. And I think one of the things that we learned is we have a tremendous educational institution process within Middlesex County with the colleges of Rutgers and Princeton. And we have, just to name a few, and our own educational process with the academies of math, science, and technology. The challenge that we were facing was we were, once they graduated, they were going and following their jobs because we did not communicate or lay out to them a vision of what we offer within the county proper. And so a key element of our branding strategy is that to recognize our assets so that as we communicate, as we define who we are, what we do and why we do it, that educational opportunity has to be linked to business opportunities that we're trying to establish right here in Middlesex County. And taking a step further, it's, our view is this is just not about Middlesex County. It's also about the relationship we have with the other regional entities and other counties and other municipalities throughout the state, because we are better together. And so we have to make sure that the lessons that we've learned, the elements we're incorporating in our overall way of doing business has to be expanded well beyond the boundaries of Middlesex County. And the perfect example of that is obviously with COVID, our ability from testing to the vaccination programs and working closely with the state, working closely with other regional county entities. We are only as effective collectively. It brings greater power to what we do if we can drive the same messaging, the same information, and the same branding as it relates to specific services. So again, from a county standpoint, what I can say is this, that when we didn't have a marketing strategy, it wasn't clear, and it was to many people on what we did, other than raising taxes or spending money. We maybe fix roads, put new signals in, have a nice set of recreational facilities, but we're much more than that, and we have an obligation to tell that story. And I think the other thing we've learned is we don't tell the story not only through the marketing channels, but we tell this story through our ambassadors, which is our workforce. If they embrace what we're doing on behalf of the residents, they become a voice, a part of that marketing strategy, right? And so it is authentic, and it's real. Because if you don't make it real and you don't make it sustainable, people see right through that. You could put a good commercial up on TV and you could, paint a beautiful picture, but if it's built on quicksand, ultimately people will know that, get frustrated by it, and then have no desire to be part of it. So everything that we do has to have a sustainable long-term strategy that really our community can embrace, from both the business sector as well as our community. And our ability to partner with that and merge those two together, we become a resource of workforce to the businesses we're trying to attract here, right? It's an essential part of our marketing strategy. So, though I've kind of bounced around in a lot of different areas, you see that marketing plays a role, not just in telling the story of who we are, but bringing the right people together to do it together effectively. And if there's any message I leave there, is that marketing is and branding and aligning that with the services that we provide to our community are essential in order to make sure that individuals and businesses find value of why they should live, work, and stay here.
John, one thing I wanted to comment on, I think the echo, I don't know if it's mine or somebody else, but can you hear me all right? John, when we first started this, working with you, Middlesex County, historically, it's the dead center of the state, right? The bullseye in the state, pretty much equidistant between New York City and Philadelphia, a little closer to New York City. And a lot of the story around that was really, and this is kind of legacy thinking around place, it was just location, location. And so to the extent that people even understood the Middlesex County story, it was just about where you happened to be located, kind of almost like an accident of geography. Talk about the difference now, just a little bit in the fact that years later we've been communicating the brand of Middlesex, all that it has to offer, and the depth and the breadth. What has that done to realign internally and externally the perception of Middlesex County itself in that region?
A couple things come to mind. When you talk about being in the right location, that's great. But I think what was getting lost is the fact that in order to sustain or to build off of your location, you really need to make sure that you have a long-term strategy, because in the world we live in, the world changes quickly, and we no longer, location by itself, because things can be done virtually, is losing to some degree its real value. And the fact that we have now incorporated our strategy into our marketing strategy into who we are, it's really allowed us to expand the understanding of what Middlesex County truly offers, well beyond just its location, right? And I think I do believe that our ability to expand past the boundaries of New Jersey and it's starting to attract businesses outside of that area is not because of location anymore, but it's because of the value that's inherent to Middlesex County that people didn't know about it. Because we always said Middlesex County is best kept secret because no one laid out the picture of what it really was about and what it offered. Marketing strategy has allowed us to do that in a way that it has allowed people to understand we're more than just about location. There's intrinsic value from an education standpoint, right? From a technology standpoint, from a resource standpoint. So all those elements start to now play into the decisions hopefully businesses will make to come and relocate here, but also to attract. Listen, a business is not going to come if it can't find the resources or maybe move some of its people, right? And so if you can tell that story in the most effective and authentic way, it becomes easier for a corporation to say, hey, I'm going to move into Middlesex County because I know some of my people are going to come with me because they see the same value. We never had any of that before.
So the quality of life piece becomes an essential part of that place brand strategy.
It absolutely has to be. It has to be on so many fronts, And if it's not just about just defining the story of Middlesex County, also be able to describe the story around Middlesex County and what's out there, beyond its boundaries, that, again, being located in Middlesex offers you that opportunity, right? So, absolutely.
Thank you, John. That's a great perspective, and I'm sure there are going to be further questions about that. I'd like to turn it over to Christopher Zimmerman. And Christopher, get your approach, your perspective from the standpoint of both the nonprofit world working around place and, as Tyson mentioned earlier, a former elected official in Arlington, Virginia, which is a vibrant and thriving county outside of DC.
Thanks. And thanks for having me here. So as Bill just said, my perspective is, from a couple different vantage points. I'm an economist by training and profession, and then I spent a lot of my life in local government, about 18 years in my community, and for the last, going on 8 years now, with a national mission-driven nonprofit. So to start with, that nonprofit Smart Growth America is an organization that works around the country, basically to promote sustainable and equitable development. And in economic development terms in the 21st century, for the reasons Brandon laid out in the beginning, that's a lot about placemaking to start with. So for all the reasons Brandon said, which is a lot of what we actually go out and try to explain to folks in all kinds of different communities, because it's the reality, whether you're in big city coastal place where they know it, or rural America in small towns where they have to learn it in many cases and understand what it means for them. So much of this is about placemaking, and it certainly was for my community when I was involved in local government. And so the relationship between that and place branding is significant for a number of reasons. And a lot of what we talk about with branding and some of the previous discussion, particularly much of what John was talking about is sort of the external side, kind of the external market, and there's a lot of that because you need to bring people in. You need if you're marketing a main street, you have restaurants that need patrons. You have businesses that need customers. You're trying to tell people on the outside why this is a place that they might want to come to. I think John made the good connection between that and the internal, question of how you think about yourself, which affects whether you get, for instance, to retain people coming out of your local universities, which is a big factor in a lot of places we work in, places with, institutions not quite as prestigious or famous as, say, Rutgers and Princeton, but nonetheless really important, where they turn people out with skills who then go somewhere else, right? So that's an example of why the internal focus is important. In my experience, particularly with projects that I worked on, closely for a lot of years, at a very fundamental level, it's really a lot about identity, because in many cases, what you have is a product that hasn't been created yet. And so I want to go back a little bit to Brandon's first point about how placemaking, that broader view he talked about, where it's not just this kind of like project thing you do, but it's everything from the thinking about it, the conceiving of it, the work you do on planning, the things you adopt, the actions you take, some of them physical, and afterwards too. It never stops. If you are in a situation like that from beginning to end, then it really becomes a question of creating an identity. So in my case, for instance, one of the things that I spent the entirety practically of my 18 years in local government on concerned an area in my community that I happen to live in, and that regarded itself, if it had any notion about itself, it was that it was the neglected part. And but it didn't really, there was no cohesion around the neighborhoods in this part of town, and there were a lot of things people wanted to see happen, individual one-off things that would be good things. Everybody thought there'd be people who would think this is what we need to have happen if the county would do this, if the county would do that. But in order to actually get a sustained effort that ultimately was, although we didn't have this language when we started this in the 90s necessarily, but was really about placemaking, we had to have an idea about ourselves that would, around which everybody could organize. And it really is, and I this is important in the work when we work in my organization around the country in places, you've got to get the folks in the community together around an idea that they have a common interest about something. They're all very different. They have different interests, and they're going to fight on lots of things. They're going to be at odds over, all kinds of things. But they have to have a notion that there is some kind of, collective purpose that they can unite around to make anything happen. At one level, that's how do we get the government to actually care and focus on? How do we get businesses? How do we get people to invest, to think, yeah, this is a place that might be happening at some point? There's a whole lot of pieces that got to get moved. And the first thing is, do all these stakeholders, local residents, business owners, property owners, officials, all these folks, do they see something? Is there something around which they can and organize themselves and develop and pursue some kind of common agenda? And that's harder when you don't already have any kind of brand. And but here I mean the fundamental brand being, are we a community that, do we have this name? We all agree we're part of a community. If everybody's using a common frame of reference for where we are, you've at least got to start. And in the case that I was referring to, in the longest thing that I was involved in, we were starting with a bunch of communities that didn't think of themselves as a community, right? That there were these individual neighborhoods, there's individual parts. And the first thing was really to get everyone around that idea that, for at least some purposes in one sphere, this is a common community we can talk about. And that's like the fundamental brand. The real part around the community around this would be Main Street. And in the long run, that was essential not only for getting, support for the things we wanted to have done, for getting plans adopted, for getting funds invested, all that. But after the fact, just as much, on an ongoing basis, and today as much as 20 years ago, that factor of it being a living, breathing thing that's never done, that you have to keep working at, which means all these connections have to be maintained, kind of starts with that fundamental question of, do you have an identity? So, to me, that's like the bedrock of the branding idea. You get specific things on top of that, and you get specific campaigns or slogans or whatever, and those things may change with time, depending on what's marketable and what the language or vocabulary is in a given year. But the fundamental fact of branding to me ties back to that question of identity and getting a common understanding of an identity around which we can all agree for these purposes, even if we're going to fight on lots of other things. We have this, so then we can have a common sense of purpose, which is the only way you get to do all the really hard things that are necessary if you're going to create a great place out of something that maybe wasn't there before.
Thanks, Chris. Question about that. I think it builds exactly on what both Brandon and John were talking about, and you talked about needing to get people. You didn't use the word aligned, but basically aligned, right,
Yeah.
around the story and the perspective of the place they're in. How, when you go through this today, when you went through it then, when you go through it today, how do you do that? How do you get a place to think of itself as we are not a group of only individuals or businesses or disparate municipalities or communities. We are a place, and that story is X. What that look like as you walk people through that, or walk entities and places through it?
Well, I guess the glib answer is, 127 meetings inside of, 18 months or something like that. I mean, there's a lot of talking. There's a lot of getting people together, starting with the people who already think they have some common idea or something in common and want to talk to each other. And then the harder part, getting the people who wouldn't necessarily have talked to each other together. And through that, developing, seeing what emerges as what are the things that, it turns out we all kind of agree on and want, which even in the most diverse group, there's always quite a bit of stuff that actually people have in common. And they even come up with some of the same ideas. Now, some people with ideas that don't fly, but then they get to hear that it doesn't fly and why it doesn't fly. And you start with the things that you can boil into, is this fundamental? And you get to a point where it clicks and everybody says, yes, that's us. And that's really just the start. But that's like the first part of it, is getting everybody to work through common, in common, the intellectual process of thinking this through, seeing what their counterparts are thinking, and finding their way to the set of things that we all can buy into. That let's work from that perspective. That's the beginning. But it's again, it's a lot of talking, a lot of dialogue.
Yeah, and what I think one of the most important things about that is it's never should be as simple as simply having good marketers or creative marketers, and I put TopRight in the mix and saying, hey, we come up with a really cool campaign, sounds great, awesome, looks beautiful. It may not authentically be representative, but it sounds great, and really doing the hard work, and John talked about this as well, of creating or identifying, bringing it to the surface, and then refining that authentic story. Yes. Because otherwise it's just another campaign that has no real relationship per se. But if you can create that story based on authenticity, then not only is it effective externally, but it aligns people internally, correct? And so that really becomes about us, if you will.
And that's the way to keep it, an ongoing thing. And because that's part of what people have to ultimately realize, that the 127 meetings they went to aren't enough. And that none of us get to quit. So we have to keep working at this. And that means that it has to be based on, as you were just saying, that stuff we're all committed to.
Very good. Well, I think, Clark Dean, I know you were coming in a bit late. I think I saw your screen. There you are. And yeah. I don't know how.
So I've been here the whole time. I just didn't have my camera on for some reason.
Oh, very good. All right, good. All right. So you've heard the conversation to date. So Clark, from your perspective, looking at it, obviously, as someone who's involved in enormous developments and has been in the past, walk us through your perspective on place branding, placemaking, the importance of it, and what it means to you.
No, absolutely. And I think what Chris was just talking about is really essential to all of this, and that is it really has to be driven by authentic purpose. So we've been saying for a long time, when people talk about placemaking and what that means, or you mentioned earlier that this idea that real estate had been about location. We've actually been for quite some time thinking that that instead of real estate really being about location, 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 that it is and actually always has been about people, people, people. Right? I mean, location was just like this second order proxy to where people were. You can place make and create a purpose for people to aggregate, to come together. Then you can actually transform a place because you're transforming the economic interactions that occur in that place and creating value, which then creates this, some people call like a campfire effect. You know, you have this bright campfire that draws people to it. Some people talk about the dense market effect. You know, if you're selling or buying a product, there's a great there's sort of this great impetus to go to the densest market, and so as a result, you end up having these clusterings of markets where you have the densest market and then all other markets, right? In particular areas. And so what we found is lately, when people have been saying, oh gosh, okay, if I've got a city or I've got a place, you know, I'm not Midtown Manhattan. Like, what do I do? Like, how do I create an attraction, you know, for the right kind of people to come here? What do we have? And I think we've seen that a lot of folks have first taken assessment of what do they have? You know, what are the unique attributes of their community, unique resources that they have, and the unique people that they have presently, what expertise and skill sets that might be connected in creative ways to create that gravitational pull, you know, to kind of pull other people around there in clusters. And the word that's often used around this and some of the strategies that we see being deployed are often around this idea of innovation. So you hear about innovation centers or innovation districts, right? That this is this emerging trend. And I think that what we found is that not all innovation districts have been successful. I think ones that are really focused on purpose, like as Chris was saying, the purpose-driven innovation districts can be really powerful. You know, we've been doing a lot of work in different innovation districts. Right now, involved in a major one in the middle of Atlanta around global health, the Global Health Innovation District. And part of what we discovered was that we had these unique assets in Atlanta around global health that no other city has. No other city has the density of expertise in global health that we do here in Atlanta. It is by a function of these organizations that have sort of grown up over time, CDC and Task Force for Global Health and Carter Center and American Cancer Society and all of these organizations that exist in Atlanta that provide that kind of expertise. And so the key then was it can't just be co-location, you have to co-activate. And so we've really, in our team, has done a nice job of framing what kind of innovation do we want to be known for here, and how can that be used to draw people together? So we've embraced, and of course it's apropos, given our convener today being TopRight. We're big, you know, we too love, you know, 2x2 matrices, and this idea that if you have a 2x2 matrix, where the y-axis is discovery, and the x-axis is invention, that we find that the most compelling approaches to innovation are that top right quadrant, or it's often referred to as Pasteur's quadrant, which is use-inspired discovery and invention. What does that mean? It basically means let's identify problems worth solving and then pull people together that have unique capabilities, assets, and resources to solve those problems. And as value gets created in the process of solving those problems, it draws other people to that dense marketplace. You know, again, in Atlanta right now, we're doing around global health, but there's opportunities. We're helping a client that has on the order of a building, right? So they're looking to dispose of some real estate, 30,000 square feet of real estate. We're actually helping them rethink that instead of just a subleasing assignment. Think about how do they activate that 30,000 square feet as an innovation center for them around oceanic research and oceanic innovation, because they have unique resources and capabilities that can be applied towards that field that don't exist anywhere else in the world. So now you can actually draw people to activate that space in a way that doesn't just, you know, get some real estate off their books, but actually creates value and commercial opportunities, while at the same time, in this case, actually helping out with the environmental concerns of the oceans. So I think you can apply it. You know, every community has its own thing. Or as we often refer to in our team, I'm a big believer that every person has a genius. And some people never discover what their genius is, which is a bummer, but everybody's got one. You just got to figure out what it is. And I think the same is true for placemaking. Every place has an opportunity to create value for people. But the key is just figuring out what that is and then activating in an authentic and compelling way. The one last thing I'll mention, and then we'll see where you want to take the conversation. And this gets a little geeky, but I'm a science guy, right? So I love the fact that the data actually proves out a lot of these conceptual comments that have risen throughout the day today. And guys like Bob Putnam, who was the dean of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government for years, had applied a lot of science around the idea of social capital. We often talk about human capital, we talk about intellectual capital, we talk about financial capital, but there's other things, social capital. And social capital is real. And I think we see that more now than ever before. And tapping into the concept of social capital, I think, is one of the key components to effective placemaking, because the way a place can actually connect people together and reinforce the actual value that comes from social capital can be really powerful. And we see this in scaling laws. So if you look at the density of cities, and I don't want to bum out smaller cities when I say this, because there's value in all senses of scale, but there's real value in dense cities, which is one reason, and as Brandon mentioned earlier, you look at like the course of human history, a lot of big cities have developed over time. Very, very few big cities have ever disappeared from the earth. I mean, Troy, Ephesus, and so on. But like for the most part, like big cities are like, they stay big. Well, why is that? Well, because there's value in two different elements. At one point, you have what they call sublinear efficiency scaling, right? So the bigger a city gets, the more inexpensive it is to produce, to water, to feed, to provide energy for that group of people, right? So there's this sublinear scaling from density that encourages dense urban environments. But what's even more important, and it gets back to the heart of this issue of placemaking, gets down to the heart of social capital, is the fact that you also, in a dense environment, have superlinear scaling of economic interconnectivity and economic interactions. So that as cities grow, there's more opportunities for starting new businesses, for patents, for every bit of economic type activity, because you have more people in a closer area working together. And so it's the combination of superlinear economic scaling and sublinear efficiency scaling that really brings us back to dense environments, which is one reason why, after 9/11, lower Manhattan, people left and people said, man, we have cell phones and laptops. Will we ever go back? But then the first people start going back and they find there's a competitive advantage of being in that dense environment. And then more people cluster and more people go back, and it happens. I think we're already seeing that a bit now in the midst of the pandemic. And I think it's an opportunity, wherever you are, whatever kind of real estate asset you're trying to optimize or improve the value of, whatever county or city or municipal area that you're trying to create value or place make. I think this idea of figuring out what is your genius, what kind of innovation can you stimulate and make authentic through authentic programming, and how can you take advantage of the superlinear scaling of density and the sublinear scaling of efficiency at whatever scale your community is. I think those are some important things to think about.
And Clark, just a couple of questions to talk about before we turn it over to the general Q&A, because you talk about Putnam and obviously that's who wrote Bowling Alone, right? So, which was the loss of social capital being a kind of a hollowing out of a community. And there is, of course, today, has been for some time today, a migration from some of the major cities into some of these, and I don't mean it's pejoratively, but sort of tier B, tier C cities, because of a perceived quality of life or community that's different, or that's more, or that's richer, or more robust, or you have easier access to.
Right.
In terms of branding and place, you talk about Atlanta and its health, life sciences and health capabilities. It can in some ways mirror what Silicon Valley brought together, where I lived for most of my career, in terms of just having a competitiveness cluster around those areas. But how do you still tap into that, particularly in larger and more expensive mega cities, that community or that quality of life as part of the place branding or place making? Because I know you do this a lot with many of the developments that you work with.
Right. No, absolutely, and it's complicated, right? So as cities get bigger, Idris had, and I think it was Brandon that brought up the point earlier about commute times and the formation of the suburbs or kind of these exurban urban areas. It is pretty cool. If you go back and look historically at cities, human beings like 30-minute max commute times. That's what human beings just like. They've liked it since ancient Rome, right? So interestingly enough, you could actually look, if you studied the average speed of transportation in each of these ancient cities leading all the way up to like today, you can predict with incredible accuracy the size of a city on the basis of how far people would need to travel in order to get places. So like you could predict ancient Rome because okay, people on average travel this far. What's the 30-minute commute? Boom, it's this big based on that population. Fascinating. So you can see what the land area and how it forms. I think that what we've seen is this, and Putnam talked a bit about it as part of the diagnosis of the erosion of social capital that occurred during the 20th century, where you started off, you had this incredible explosion of social capital that went from 1900 up until 1966, and it began a precipitous decline where it gave back about a third of the social capital that had accumulated in 1900, 1966. And the answer was why? And part of it was the erosion of the social capital that came from people's community where they lived being different from the community where they worked, separated by commutes, right? So all of a sudden, you have these people that you're working with in a dense urban environment, but then if you're getting your car and you're going an hour out of town, you're living there, by the time you get there, there's not a lot of time to connect or experience other people, to build relationships in your social network there. And so you are almost living two lives. And you know what? It's hard to balance two lives. It's really complicated. And so I think the strategy that a lot of urban areas, and quite frankly, the challenge, and we have it here in Atlanta as well, is how do you create affordable opportunities for people to work close to where they live and to live close to where they work, right? That's really hard. Now in Atlanta, we're blessed with a lot of land. We're not constrained by a bunch of rivers that require bridges and all that kind of stuff. So we have the capability to do that, but it still requires ingenuity. Likewise, you have some of these suburban areas that historically had sprung up because of just quality of life, but that quality of life has somewhat eroded because of the distance and this kind of bifurcation of a working environment, a living environment. And that's where you're seeing a lot of the genesis of these live, work, play communities in the suburbs that are really creating their own little dense ecosystems that are just different from like the Atlanta ecosystem. So, there are people that say they live in Atlanta, but if you look at them, they live in Alpharetta, they live in Roswell, and they're creating their own dense ecosystems that are diverse and interesting and rich. And so I would say it's not a discouragement, certainly to some of the scattered communities around the country. They can really benefit from placemaking. But I think the large scale urban areas can also benefit from it, but they've got to tackle some of these really complicated issues of affordable housing and workforce housing in order to be able to create these more complex residential and working communities that really drive the kind of the social capital that cities need in order to thrive.
That's great. Thank you very much. Well, I know we are at 1 o'clock, and I want to allow audience members to be able to ask questions. So, Tyson, let me turn it over to you to see if we have any further Q&A from those who've been listening or watching.
Yes, indeed. Hello, everyone. Great to hear from everybody. We do have a couple of questions. I think I'm going to try this name here. It's Kelly. Kelly, are you there? Kelly Schmilewski. I think she may have gotten off at 1 because she had an appointment. There, Kelly, you can turn on your microphone and ask your question if you like. Kelly, is that you? Okay, I think she's jumped off.
Okay.
But her question.
I mean, she did ask a question about the work from home. I mean, I'm happy to answer it if you think that anybody else would be interested in that.
Yeah, she did have a question for you, Clark. But her first question was for Chris. Kelly Schmielewski asks, how much influence do people who are marketing a place have on decisions made by government and other stakeholders about the place itself? A brand is only as good as the substance it can offer. Kelly says she lived in Arlington for 17 years before moving to the north end of Alexandria. She wanted to let you know that. But go ahead, Chris.
Well, I think that depends a lot, obviously, on who's doing the branding, right? But that, to some degree, goes back to my point that this only makes sense if you have all the stakeholders involved, all the players involved in the conversation from the beginning. Which means that, if you're trying to do this without people who make governmental decisions connected to it, then you're not necessarily going to be able to implement it. And if it's being done, on the other end without members of the community, then it's not going to be resonant. It's not going to be authentic. It's not going to deliver. So, I think that's the main point, is that we've got to start with fundamental areas that we can build consensus around, align all the interests, and make sure those include the major components, the people who this is supposed to serve, and the people who get to make the decisions about what happens.
And if I could jump in there, I wear these two hats, right? Marketing communications and real estate development, placemaking. And I love how this brings it together. I'm working with a small town, which also gets to the question, right, about Zoom towns and this new opportunity, because urbanism can take many forms. It doesn't just have to be, Buckhead or the Village in Manhattan. So I'm working with this wonderful community, Macon, Missouri. And, a town of about 6,000 people, 2.5 hours from St. Louis and from Kansas City, respectively. And we're really undergoing sort of a dual process there, where ostensibly it was a placemaking and downtown revitalization process. But when you start to get to the storytelling elements and what makes the place what it is, you start to come up with an existing brand and those natural assets and that history of why it's an even better place than that community may realize, sort of a forest through the trees. So that helps them hone in their message for today and improve citizen engagement, economic development in the short term. At the same time, it helps them identify, well, we want to be a bustling downtown. We want people not just to visit our repertory theater, but to stay for a whole weekend. That leads to the informing of land use decisions, of how they're going to fund, finance, and design infrastructure, where it then sort of becomes a feedback loop, as I mentioned before. So I think it's very important that both the branding reinforces and represents the actuality on the ground, and that the aspiration of place and the story that you want to tell must tie into the municipal decisions at every level, so that you can get there 1, 5, 10 years down the line.
But let me add to that, though. What you've got to be careful of is just because a municipality or a governmental entity wants something, and if it's not based on reality, then what I would expect is that the marketing team and the analysis doing has to direct them, say, listen, it's great that you want A, B, and C, but you are 180 degrees out of line with what your capabilities are. And so a lot of times the marketing world has to be say, that's great, I understand what you want, but the reality is this is who you are based on all the analysis that we've done. And this is the value proposition that you really bring to the table. And that's where that the governmental agency has to be able to keep its eyes wide open and accept that, because all too often, the political arena looks at what's in it for me today's election, not long-term future. Marketing and operations has the responsibility to open their eyes. Say, it's not just what you want, but what is it that you really bring to the table?
Okay, fantastic. If y'all can't hear me, let me know. But we got another question here from Kelly. This is for Clark Dean. How does working from home, which is likely to stick around in some increased way in a post-pandemic new normal, impact place branding? Now, we did an event a few months ago about called No Normal, which I encourage everybody to go check out on our YouTube channel. We talked about these precise issues. But Clark, what do you think? How's it going to impact place branding? And without the commute Clark talks about and the dynamic changes she adds.
So, there's no question, right, that working from home is going to have a long-lasting impact, certainly on our not only the business culture, but our structure as a country and really as a world. I get back to something that Mother Teresa said. She said that loneliness is the leprosy of our age. Loneliness is the leprosy of our age. And I believe that is true. And I think it's never been more true than that. Human beings like to interact with other human beings. And as awesome as this is to like see you guys, your faces on a screen, it's different. And my background in biomedical engineering leads me to have all kind of geeky thoughts about that. That's why that is. But they're literally, without getting into too much, chemicals in our brains that get released when we're in a room together that simply don't get released when we're looking at each other's image or face. And a lot of those chemicals actually have been shown to really be that kind of a chemical underpinnings to relationships, right, and to trust. And so there is this important dynamic, I think, around placemaking that is centered around this building of social capital that actually fundamentally can't be done in a purely remote environment. So what does that mean? Because you do have these Zoom towns that are popping up, et cetera. Is there opportunity for those areas? Absolutely. But what they have to start thinking about is how did they activate programming within their city to bring this now diverse talent that has chosen to live there, wherever these towns are all over the country, because they can, right? They can live anywhere, so they're going to be there, to understand what new talent, what new resources, what new people, if real estate's about people, what new people now constitute their community? And how can they activate meaningful and purposeful interactions amongst those people when they're not on their screens, right? Because it's that social capital that needs to get built and can be built as an incredible opportunity for some of these Zoom boom towns to build these new relationships amongst these people that right now are nomads, but that now have the opportunity to build new lives and new social structures within the towns that they've gone to. Certainly in big cities, I do believe that a lot of people are going to go back into the big cities, and as things become safe, I think that's going to be important. We're going to see a lot more hybrid type environments. But what I hear from groups as diverse as big corporates and law firms, this idea of being able to have personal mentorship in close proximity with other human beings to build trust and to build social capital is gonna really draw us back together in whatever form that takes.
Okay, we got a couple more questions here. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead to Gary Toth, who asks, in a recent podcast, Richard Florida said that after COVID, the working remotely may increase to as much as 25 to 30%. He further said that small and middle-sized communities would benefit because people will want to live in cool towns, I guess fun towns. Since I'm from Middlesex County, he says, I wonder how small towns like Dunolin and Carteret can achieve the success that places like Highland Park and Metuchen already enjoy. How can you brand for that? This one sounds like it's for John Pulomena.
One of I think the key elements that the county is embarking on is not just for the county as a whole, but recognizing that Middlesex County is made up of 25 communities. And the reality is, the world has changed. And as we attract new businesses through our marketing campaign, it spawns other smaller companies or feeder companies that are going to be required to support that industry. And, I think the work that's before us is that when we develop our economic strategy, it has to be a regional strategy. It's not just about filling a taxable void and a tax base, but it's about bringing smart business decisions, smart economic growth to a lot of those smaller communities like Metuchen in such a way that it's built off of the strength of the larger communities, right? It's an extension of that, but it also starts to draw new type of business opportunities. And I think that what we're trying to do across Middlesex County, and what's demonstrated with our relationships with Metuchen, relationship with Woodbridge and Carteret, the county has a key role of being the glue to bring it together. So individual communities or municipalities are not looking at it just upon themselves, but around the county as a whole, and the value they bring in building our community to spawn those other opportunities, even for the smaller communities. So it could be a cool place to live. right? So what we're doing in the county is for the purpose of all of the 25 towns, not any one in particular, but each one is unique into itself. And our responsibility is really to be able to bring that together in a way that drives smart economic growth in Middlesex County.
I'd like to weigh into that if I can. I think that as the point that Gary was making, more generally is valid, and the point that John was making is valid, that there's an opportunity, and I think this was true before COVID, that smaller places have a great opportunity to begin to capture what's been happening in a lot of the bigger places. And, that for a lot of reasons, one being the fact that the extreme high, prices in New York and San Francisco means people, and, Washington, D.C., people are looking at secondary markets. And so they're moving to the next tier of cities. So that's one reason. That was economically driven before COVID. Secondly, there are a lot of people who actually don't want to live in New York City. They want to live in the small town, but they actually want all the qualities that we refer to as urban. They want to have the coffee shop with good broadband access where they can go and get online and also meet people. And so there's an opportunity for just about every type of community, whether we're talking about suburban town center or rural Main Street, to take advantage of this. And that is going to be true as we emerge from pandemic. But I also say that we do know some things will have changed by as a result of pandemic. But I'm struck by the numbers that Gary cited Richard Florida saying 25 to 30% increase in remote working. Well, that might be true. I do not know how he knows that or how anyone knows that, because I think the most honest thing we can say is we do not know exactly how the effects, we can say there's going to be profound effects and probably be sure about that, but exactly how they're going to play out, we don't know that. I will say that there are two kind of countervailing things that will affect what we do after, as we emerge from this. Number one, a whole lot of folks will discover they could remotely work. And that means not just individuals discover, hey, this is pretty good, they like it for whatever reason, but a whole lot of places that rent office space right now are going to say, I don't necessarily need 100% of the office space I used to have. And if we reorganize the work a little bit differently, we're still going to have an office. We still need to get people together, but maybe we don't need. That is going to be significant, and we don't know how much that is. But if it's 5 or 10%, it's a big deal. So that's a way we know that, we just don't know the magnitude, but, it works in one direction. On the other hand, I really think there's going to be an impact of most of us are going nuts stuck in our houses, who are those of us who do work remote. Remembering there's a lot of society that doesn't have that choice and is out there now. But those of us who've been stuck in this are going to be itching to get out. And the result of past experiences, some people have pointed to after the Spanish flu, we had the Roaring 20s. But you can look at over and over again. Usually periods of plague where people fled each other are followed by big booms for cities. The Renaissance followed the Black Death and things like that. But I have this feeling that there's going to be a whole lot of stuff we can't anticipate that may lead to different ways people use places, big cities or smaller towns. But I think the public aspect of it, the gathering together and the benefit of actually working face to face is going to be really important, maybe extra important in some ways because we've been deprived of it for so long. And we don't know the way those two countervailing things are going to play out and which way it's going to tilt things. That I think is the most interesting question coming out of the pandemic.
And if I could just piggyback on that, I'll be brief. You covered a lot of sort of what I was thinking, Chris, is, first, what does working remotely mean? Is 25 to 30% mean folks are at home all the time? I don't think so. I think it's much more of a flexible work schedule, maybe in the office 2 or 3 days a week, maybe only one, but you still got to get there for key meetings. And there was a recent, and folks can certainly email me and I'll send it to them, Cushman Wakefield with Chris Lineberger, who's arguably the leading urbanist in the country, did a recent study, and I think the number is probably closer to 15 or 20%. But what you have to remember is not everyone has an extra room where they can call an office. A young professional might have 3 roommates, might be in their high school bedroom because they can no longer afford the apartment because they have had their hours cut. At best, they have 600 or 700 square feet. All of a sudden, you're home where, to Clark's point, you no longer have your home life, but then you go in and you go to work and you have your social circle and your happy hour, and then you go home at 11 o'clock and do it all over again. You have to provide those types of amenities and lifestyle now in these smaller towns that you were talking about, Gary. And then on the flip side, real quick, I think the office park, or the, even not an office park, but your dense urban core that was mixed use but office heavy, is a perfect example of they're going to need to reinvent themselves through place making before they can then tell a story that we're not just your 9 to 5 type of environment. And you see how those sort of interplay, and Northern New Jersey and your environment, John, I think is really primed to take advantage of that. And I know you guys already have. And that's as a Long Islander saying that. So God bless you.
No, you're absolutely right, Brandon. And it's funny. I mean, a lot of my day job is spent, working with these corporates and firms. They're trying to figure out, okay, we got all these leases. What do we do with the space? Like, what is the future? And we recently went through this Transwestern with Ronstadt. It's a company that's got over 300 offices in 30 different regions, and help them go through figuring out, not only where should their offices be placed in order to create look into the talent they recruit and to the customers they serve, but what kind of spaces do they provide for their people to work in, and how do they use it? And it's a pretty dramatically different approach, and we did it in 9 months, like during the pandemic, but has led to a complete portfolio repositioning that we're rolling out right now. And I think they're not alone in companies that are transforming, but I'll transition that statement to what I heard from 2 different law firms, major law firms last week. And that was this idea of a social structure actually drives people's employment choices as well, right? And even their job choices. There are a lot of people that get into the practice of law because they kind of like the idea of being a part of a firm. I'm a King and Spalding man, right? I'm going to go to the office and be around these kinds of people that have this kind of intellectual wit and repartee. And I'm going to go to lunch, and I'm going to go to drinks, and I'm going to do deals. And firms around the country have become convening places where business gets done, where nonprofits get served, right? They have their big conference rooms, and that are not only used for business but for social in the community. Those become really brand identifiers for those organizations, and they set themselves apart because of the space that they use, how they activate that space, and how that space shapes the behavior of its occupants. And I think as we think to the future, as companies figure out how they activate their office assets differently, or how they use that differently, I think a lot of it is going to be less, providing desk for people to do head down work, and more about purpose-driven space that's around collaborative processes and interactions that require people being engaged in different ways, recognizing that there is an enormous equity disparity amongst people in the office and what they have at home. So if you think about office space is a major, kind of the egalitarian atmosphere, you might rise to a rank in a company, and you've got a certain type of office environment that you get provided for that rank. And you might have an income equality amongst others that perform similarly, but the outcome may be unequal, right? So you might, as a young person coming out of college, you might have the same pay grade as someone else, but because of your own personal social responsibilities, you might be paying for a sister or a sibling to go to school. You might be, supporting mom and dad. You might doing different things. Your outcome of where you can live is not necessarily at the same level of the office space in which you work. And because space does shape behavior, companies have to think about, are they willing to abdicate control of the environment that might shape the behavior of their professionals to being reliant upon how their residential accommodations are resourced, or are they going to find ways to identify where those gaps are and to fill that need in space that they continue to provide for people? And I mean, there are no easy answers yet, right? Everybody's working through it, but it's going to have a transformational, I think, impact on business. And there's a lot of opportunity for organizations that do think clearly about ways to create value and attract the kind of talent and assemble the kind of talent and create the kind of social structures that the most talented individuals are really seeking. And those are ultimately going to be the organizations that win.
Okay, fantastic. We're at about an hour 20 here, but I do have one last question from Omar Latif. Let's make it a quick one, just in the interest of time here. But John Pulomena, with your work with TopRight over the years, what recommendations can you suggest for government agencies seeking strategic marketing plans and branding services? What do you think?
Before they, I'll take it in the context of what, the experience and the journey we've been on in Middlesex County. An entity, a governmental entity, when they make that decision, they've got to be all in. It can't be a facade to say, oh, we're changing the culture, we're moving forward on rebranding who we are, and then just use marketing as the tool to say, look what we've done. But the outside forces drove what the marketing team has done. The outcome is going to be all wrong. If you're going to make that investment, which is the second piece of this, it is clearly an investment to do this. But what most governmental agencies don't realize is that the money they're spending on marketing, if they consolidated under a central entity that drives that marketing and branding strategy for the enterprise, the value of using those dollars wisely will, in my mind, more than compensate for the increased value you need to bring to the table. But it's got to be the commitment of the governmental agency to recognize the role marketing plays, and not just defining who you are, but making sure the analysis and the assessment to come to the table with the types of products and services and the role that entity plays has to be left in the hands of the the knowledgeable marketing team, like a TopRight, to provide that added value and to trust that value. And to, at the same time, establish a metric that says, what is my return on that investment? The reality is that investment doesn't happen in year 1 or year 2 or year 3. It will happen in year 6, 7, 8, if that marketing strategy is really consistent with what that entity can achieve from the eyes of our marketing team. Because one of the things that we've done in Middlesex County is, though we never had a marketing organization, we brought in TopRight to fill that void, to begin that journey. But we also have an obligation to build part of those mechanics in-house. And I believe that combination of in-house talent and more the global talent that TopRight or any marketing entity brings to the table brings you the right balance on the journey you need to be on. But at the end of the day, they've got to be committed to invest the dollars and to invest in that professional resource to do the job and not manipulate in a way that allows them to deliver a short-term message built on quicksand.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, Bill, you want to close us out?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, I know we've gone over a little bit, and I appreciate the time of the speakers. And Brandon, John, Chris, and Clark, thank you for taking the time out of your schedules. As you can tell by the conversation and the discussion, we could go at this for a while. It just every question opens up further questions, because there's such an essentially important topic now for how we all are part of not just the place where we live and work, but helping others think through what does that mean and what is the essence of that brand and the story that defines a place and enables it to engage differently and deeper with its residents and its businesses. I've enjoyed it tremendously, gentlemen. I had the privilege of working with most of you, and it's truly been a privilege, and hopefully our audience found it to be insightful. I know Tyson, this is being recorded as well, and any further from anyone, any further questions or queries, if you send them to us, and the Tyson will get them answered, route them to our guest speakers. But thank you for all the time, all of our speakers, and thank you to all who are listening. Tyson?
Yeah, thanks, everybody. I appreciate the time. Thanks to our audience as well. Some great questions and some great talks. You guys were great. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Thanks.
Take care, y'all.
Take care. Bye.